And I want to offer a welcome to, of course, my colleagues on the faculty and staff, all of our students who could be here today, although we are heavily into reading period and exams. It's good to have all of you here. Also, let me welcome any alumni and certainly our friends, and in particular, the Adams family members who are here. I think we still are expecting at least one more who will arrive a little late, flying in this morning, and also guests from far and near, many of you from Detroit. So thank you all for being here, and welcome to Harvard Divinity School. Today we have the certainly joyful occasion of celebrating Charles G. Adams, but it's a little sad for those of us who know that Charles will be ending his term as a professor here. To have had him the last 5 years has been simply a great joy and pleasure for me and for my colleagues, and certainly for all the students who have benefited from having him here. But it is wonderful to be able to celebrate him on the occasion of the conclusion of his appointment at Harvard Divinity School as the William and Lucille Nickerson Professor of the Practice of Ethics and Ministry. Charles has kindly offered to have members of his own family be part of the program today. I'm very glad for that, as well as members of his larger family, the congregation in Detroit, and a friend from his academic family who's going to deliver an address to us, and I think will be introduced by Charles after his remarks this morning, Dr. Angela Dillard, professor at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And those of you who may not have read her first book, first major book at least, which is really a wonderful monograph that I had the pleasure to read 4 or 5 years ago when it came out. I urge you to look into it. We have a really fine scholar here to talk with us this morning. My sincere thanks go to the organizing committee for this event, in particular Gina Lee and Kristen Guntz from our HDS staff, and Mrs. Edith Clifton, who always seems to be there wherever Charles is doing anything around the country from Detroit. We will have several speakers, but Dr. Adams is going to deliver the keynote address for this event about the two things that I think he's cared about most of his adult life, and he continues to care about them. His address is entitled Treasured University, Troubled City, Harvard and Detroit. At the end, we're going to have time for questions from the audience, and at 11:30, we will all go down the hall to the Brown Room. That's this direction as far as you can go, for a brunch reception and a program honoring Charles on behalf of the school, with tributes both from his colleagues and from his students. So I know we're all looking forward to that. But now it's my pleasure to ask Dr. Tara Washington, Charles's daughter, to come to the podium to introduce her father, Charles G. Adams.
Good morning. I'm so happy to be a part of this special tribute to my father, your colleague, your professor, and your pastor. I feel, as you do, that he was absolutely the ideal choice to be the first Nickerson Professor of the Practice of Ethics and the Ministry. On a large scale, we know that he has proven to be an expert in bringing communities together through his preaching for social change. Up close, he's an energetic presence that inspires and challenges his students to think critically and then translate that thinking into action. But I've always known Charles Adams as an amazing father, a father who enjoys a great seafood dinner, a good movie, and good clean humor. But he's also an amazing father who's always been willing to give his very generous support for any worthwhile endeavor that I wanted to pursue, especially the academic ones. But as a daughter, what makes me the most proud is his bold and courageous support of women, often in the face of great opposition, especially women who wanted to pursue non-traditional roles. So on behalf of all of the women whose lives you have touched, women who wanted to be preachers, deacons, scholars, judges, and doctors, I thank you and I congratulate you on this crowning achievement of your most distinguished career. I present to you Professor Charles Gilchrist Adams.
I thank my daughter for learning from me the art of hyperbole. Thank you very much. It is wonderful to be here, wonderful to have been invited to bring these remarks. And I want to thank Dean Graham for his generosity, thank Mrs. Graham for her hospitality. There was a night here when I felt as if I was homeless. The hotel had put me out, and I couldn't find a place to stay. So the word got to Dean Graham that I had been ejected from the hotel and had nowhere to stay. And immediately says, he can stay here. And so I spent several nights at Jewel House and had wonderful meals, avocados every day. And I certainly really enjoyed that, and I certainly felt welcomed and affirmed by that experience. Also, I have been warmed and gladdened by the faculty. The faculty has always been outstanding, I believe always will be, because of the nature of the work, the importance of the work, and the great talent that is attracted to the work. Just yesterday, we had one of our students to preach in the church that I serve, Helen Kim. And she's very, very special, and she did a remarkable, remarkable job. Made me very proud that I had the privilege, gratuitously, of being one of her teachers. We won't say which one made her great, but it's just been wonderful being a part of those who helped to prepare such a marvelous person. She's, as you know, going on with PhD work right here, and she will remain in ministry with a wonderful education from a great institution. I also want to thank, above all, the students who have been very kind to this grandfatherly figure that comes from the church, and they've allowed me to represent my faith as long as it remained open and inclusive of all faiths. And that was not easy for me, not difficult for me to do, because that's always been my leaning, and it's always been my privilege to be in a church, the church that I now serve, in which church I was born and blessed and baptized and married and licensed to preach and ordained to preach, and then called to minister. And that church means a lot to me, and it has been it's been my education, my delight, my ecstasy, my joy, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate being able to share the experiences that I've learned there and also here, where I served the Concord Baptist Church for 6¼ years. So I'm grateful for that. I'm also grateful for my family, and particularly my soulmate, Agnes Hadley Adams, whom I'm going to give her a few of my minutes. I don't need 25 minutes to do what I'm going to do here today. And I'm going to ask her just to say a word, because I know that she, along with myself, is grateful for all of the love and the help and the support that we've received from you and from those whom you represent. Come, Agnes.
Good morning, everyone. To Dean Graham, Mrs. Barbara Graham, to the Harvard Divinity School faculty and friends, of course, I'm Agnes Hadley Adams, spouse of the remarkable, profound, unselfish, compassionate friend to many, Pastor Charles G. Adams. I'd like to thank you very much for inviting him to be a professor here at this great university. And I'd especially like to thank Dean Graham and Mrs. Barbara Graham for giving him a place to stay when he didn't have a place to stay and showing him so much hospitality. Thank you so very much. May God bless you, and may God bless this great university now and all the years to come. And thanks for having us.
My son took a very dangerous chance to fly out on the same day of an event. Anything can happen. I told him he shouldn't have done it without consulting me. But he'll be here by and by. I'd like to first begin by saying that one of the great blessings of my life was the friendship and the teaching, the support, and guidance of Preston Williams. Now, I know he's very uncomfortable with my calling his name, but I was here when he came to begin his graduate study, and we befriended each other. I saw Connie wheeling the young baby boys around the campus. They are now grown men. And Preston and I would talk and dream of an opportunity to emphasize social transformation in the structures of the church, in the work of the church, to make that an outstanding characteristic. You wonder what is the characteristic of a church, and I'll have some comments about that later in these scattered, very scattered remarks. We would dream about it, and when he received his PhD and was on the faculty of Boston University, he included me to come and talk to his classes about the black church. And then when he was appointed here, he continued to make sure that the black alumni were included in the alumni participation in the life of the school. So we organized, under his leadership, under his kind invitation, we organized the Black Alumni of HDS. And the Black Alumni was called upon, he doesn't like me to mention it, but he was acting dean at one time. And he certainly called us in for counsel, and even some persons who were not among the black alumni, but were black scholars whom he consulted to be a part of working toward a divinity school that would remain sensitive and would increase its sensitivity toward the African American situation in America and, of course, in the world. And it was during his interim deanship that we organized the Black Alumni Association and met sometimes in his office, sometimes in larger quarters as we grew. And our very first effort was to raise money so that African American students would be able to study here. And we were successful in raising $100,000. And that money, of course, in good old Harvard fashion, he says, now we've got to learn Harvard's way, also in the church. And that is not to just receive the money and spend every dime, but to receive it, invest it, let it grow, and it will be a blessing to generations. And that's exactly what happened. We invested the Harvard invested it, we made it available, $100,000, and it is now worth millions. And African American students will continue to be educated at HDS for generations to come. And we're grateful for him for doing that. We're also grateful that he organized the Alumni Association. After we had achieved that, then the issue was, what shall we do in even a more meaningful way to represent ourselves as grateful and loyal sons and daughters of HDS. So we decided that we would go where the problems are in the cities of America, and we would take some classes and discussions and some professors from here, some professors from other institutions, and we would have an institute on various issues, various programs that we felt would help the problems that we all must face, particularly in urban America. That work took us to Washington, D.C. in 1982. We met with the people, the good people, of Shiloh Baptist Church, a university church, a teaching church, a very strong, active church, and they were in the process at that time of completing a brand new social service center for the community, particularly for the students. We met there, and our keynote speaker was Harold Washington, who at that time was not the mayor of Chicago, but was a U.S. congressman from Chicago district. And he told us on that evening that he addressed us that he was going to run for mayor. And indeed he did, and a great change he brought about in the city of Chicago, which the city even now enjoys. We next met in a conference at another church. The church has already been mentioned here. In 1984, the conference came to Detroit, which was having its problems then, and of course has its problems today. And our subject was how the church can act responsibly in the economy, what the relationship should be between the church and the economy, economic opportunities, etc. And it was at that time that we had a great crowd, and I think we had leading ministers and leading entrepreneurs and great scholars of African American religion to address us. And that was a wonderful, wonderful. The third one was held here in 1987. Didn't meet every year, but we would meet whenever we could. And that was the conference where we permanently affected not only the cities, as we talked about poverty, but we did something for Harvard University. We staged and presented William Julius Wilson. And from that, Harvard laid hands upon him and would not turn him loose. And he is here now in the Department of Sociology. I mention his work because I want you to know what a great activist Preston is. He's quiet and certainly not bombastic, but he's an activist. He studied activism, he's written about activism, and he practices activism. So here we are, trying to convince the thick-headed Detroit City Council to allow the church to bring retail into our quadrant of the city, in a city that had not seen any new nationally based retail in 60 years. Wow. The life had been drained out of the city. It wasn't all race that drained it. There were other reasons for that. But there were few places for people to work in the city, and there were certainly very few places for people to shop. And Preston and I together approached the city council. When they saw him walk in, they knew that somebody very special was walking into their chambers knocking on their doors, waving William Julius's book when work disappears, and making things happen. And because of his visit, he's not going to like me for telling you this, we had to have a supermajority of city council in order to bring the retail to the city, in order to allow Kmart to move into the city, and particularly in a neighborhood that was partially business, but also partially sleepy. They really liked to sleep in that neighborhood, and they didn't want anything to wake them up in the middle of the night. And yet Kmart moved in 24/7. And here is Preston and a preacher walking up and down, changing the vote. We not only got a majority, we got a supermajority. Out of 9, we got 8 votes. And best wishes from the one person who did not support us. He is now of blessed memory, and I know that he smiles upon the work that he opposed, but he was not opposed to. I thank God for this treasured university, which through its agents and agencies fosters the healing of nations, not by force, but by love, by service, by dedication, and above all, by understanding. I encountered this treasured place in the fall of 1958. I came by train, took a taxi from South Station. The cab driver was quite pessimistic when he said to me, "Welcome to Boston, which will soon be dead. It is a dying city and a hopeless place." Little did he realize that a Mayor Collins would soon emerge with his urban developer, Edward Logue, who had big plans for the city. And we saw a huge tower rise right in the shadow of the church that I was to serve in just a few years, the Prudential Center in the south end of Boston. I saw it go up. I also saw the Hancock go up, and much of what is now the skyline of Boston happened right before my eyes. And I sort of believe that where Boston is situated has a lot to do with Boston's vibrant condition. It sits in collegial proximity and relationship to several great institutions: Harvard, MIT, Boston College, Brandeis, Boston University, Northeastern, Wellesley. Not far away from us is Brown. Not far away from us is Smith and others. For the academic life and anthropological character and vast renewal of Boston and vicinity. And right in the heart of all of this growth and activity also was Harvard University. And it was very, very effective, efficacious. My granduncle had a lot to do with my coming here. I had already been accepted in Chicago Theological with money provided that gave me a profit after having paid all bills. I was going to be on Easy Street. And my uncle said, "Where are you going to seminary?" I said, "Chicago." He says, "No, you're not. You're going to Harvard. There's only one Harvard in the world, and I want you there." I said, "You're going to pay for it?" He said, "No." He said that I have no intention of robbing you of the best advantage of an education, and that is the strength that comes from the struggle to obtain it. So go and struggle, my boy. And I'm not sending you a thin dime. So with much love, but no money, I came to this living and wonderful place. I found great joy among the students, always as Harvard students, open-minded, always ready for a good argument, always disagreeing, but always affirmative of other points of view. I learned much from the students. I learned much from the faculty. It was a faculty that was growing under our good friend, who was the dean then, Douglas. Walter Douglas? Horton, Douglas Horton. And he brought in, very close to my coming, I think Dr. Pfeiffer had passed recently, and Frank Moore Cross was chosen to replace him as a Hancock, no relation to me, professor, Hebrew Bible. He also was over the Semitic Museum, and he brought along his teacher, my first year, who came, had a heart attack, and was not able to teach for one term. But after that, he taught until he passed away, George Ernest Wright. And then George Hunston Williams was already here, and Heiko Obermann, George Farowski, church history, Paul Lehman, Richard Reinhold Niebuhr in theology, James Luther Adams in social and theological ethics, and George Arthur Buttrick, professor of preaching and church administration. Also, he was the preacher to Memorial Church and former professor of Christian morals. And from these persons, particularly in the Harvard Center for World Religions, which was just getting started in 1960, and brought in many scholars, among them Robert Slater, who was the first director, and then William Cantrell Smith a little later. We had a chair for Catholic studies. I saw a chair for women's studies, Jewish studies, Islamic studies, and African American religions and cultures, Asian, Latin American. This treasured university studies the history, culture, and religions of the world. It teaches us to understand that as strong as our identity is, it's our relationships that is the greatest truth about our being. One race is not the only race, nor is one religion, one church, the only one. And our humanity hinges not only upon embracing reality and twisting it to our nature, but being embraced by reality and being twisted into a higher nature than we could ever achieve by ourselves. And in this university, and particularly in this school, there has always been a reaching and a questing for a religion, for a culture, for a university that embraces all life for the better. For God created everything and called it very good, and Augustine made bold to say, everything that is good, potentially and ultimately. The university exists to make the world better. Angela Dillard has the evidence. She's unearthed the evidence that my predecessor in the pastorate, a gentleman whom she will introduce to you as Charles Andrew Hill Sr., a man of very, very humble beginnings, so humble that he lived for a while as a child in an orphanage. And he was a black child in a white German Protestant orphanage. And when he went to Lincoln University in 1917, he encountered the writings, and I was given part of his library. And in the part that I have the oldest editions of the works of Rauschenbusch. And he also had in that library the works of Harry Emerson Fosdick, Henry Sloane Coffin, Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, and others. He was an idealist. He lived modestly and effectively among us. And these persons, my Uncle Gordon Hancock and also Charles Hill, never saw a child that they were not willing to teach, never saw a problem that they were not willing to tackle, never saw an injustice that they were not willing to die to help correct, never saw a hunger or a thirst or a sickness that they were not willing to reverse. I am what I am by the gracious love of God and by the goodness of people. Benjamin Elijah Mays, one of my great mentors in life, a man very careful with his money. Benjamin Mays preached once a sermon entitled, "Everywhere I Turn, I See Jesus." I see Jesus in the faces of people. I see Jesus in the suffering of people. I see Jesus in the beauty and the love and the conscience and the faith of people. I see Jesus in every person, every place, everything. Everywhere I go, I see love. I see liberty in the form of opportunity. There is in our culture a squeamish hesitation about love. Men want fire in their bellies, but none in their hearts. They are afraid that if they show their love, someone will call them different. Women likewise fear that if they express love, they will be perceived as loose. Nations are afraid that if they speak of love, they will become vulnerable to enemy attack. Politicians believe that if they express love, that they will be seen as wimps. And even church folks think that if they make love supreme, they will be seen as lacking in truth, discipline, and toughness. So love is not getting much play anywhere. Noam Chomsky of MIT is troubled over the use of pre-fascist religious fundamentalism in the United States, the Middle East, Africa, and the world. 3/4 of the American population believes that Christianity is basically reactionary when it comes to social and political questions. 9% believe in Darwinian evolution, while 41% believe that the world was created just a few years ago. Chomsky concludes religious fundamentalism can be a very scary phenomenon. It could be the mass base for an extremely dangerous popular movement. It is extremely unfortunate that this phenomenon exists. It is more unfortunate that such a fundamentalism gets identified with normative Christianity. Can you imagine a dangerous dogmatism without love, carrying the banner of the religion of Jesus? A more ironic capitulation to culture is hardly imaginable. Our culture seems determined to make love a joke, a scandal, or a fantasy. The same fate is reserved for love's firstborn child, and that is justice. Christians are afraid that if they take a stand on a principle of justice, that they will be ipso facto confessing private sexual interests and fantasies. Affirmative action and civil rights are assumed to be code words for unmerited privileges. Likewise, the movement toward an inclusive ministry for men and women is mistaken to be a smokescreen to hide scandalous behavior. Any rhetoric of love and redistributed opportunity and power excites fear and anger and disgust and political assassination. I'm proud to say that I've been impeached twice in various offices that I held and surrendered. The church today is characterized more by the love of power than the power of love. Though God is love, and though Jesus taught that the two most important commandments centralize love as the supreme virtue of the Christian community, those who are called by the name of Christ have not made love their chief concern. How many Christians have been known primarily as people of love? How many churches have made love the chief criterion for church membership or orders? What is it that people think about when they attempt to define the essence of a Christian and the character of the church? What is the first thing that Christians think about when they explain to others who they are and why they do what they do? I sadly confess to you that when I'm called upon to describe the quality of the church I serve or the character of the denomination I have led, I do not give love first place in my descriptions, definitions, and explanations. When I read about what it takes to grow a church, love is not first, nor does it appear on the list. Is it really our reverence alone that makes us silent and keeps us dumb about the subject of love? Is it not our failure and our fear? It is difficult to talk about love because the word love has been bandied about and can mean anything from the most frivolous impulse to the deepest and sublimest commitment. Love seems too simple, too sentimental, too weak for the rulers of the world and the leaders of the church. We would rather follow Robert's rules of order than obey Jesus' new commandment of love. American preacher Charles Jefferson said, "The greatest tragedy of the ages is that after 2,000 years, Christianity has not been identified with love." But the church must, I think, change that. Chrysostom of the 4th century complained that in his day, Christians demonstrated all too little love. And Jesus' greatest commandment is too often our least concern. We like to make God a tyrannical monopolizer of power without love, or a stern lawgiver and bookkeeper without love, or an indulgent grandfather without love, who caters to our whims and the cravings of our egoism and greed without love. Or we make God the absolute and omnipotent enemy of all of our racial, cultural, national, academic, and doctrinal enemies without love, giving us license to hate, hurt, kill, and destroy those with whom we disagree, even if we destroy ourselves in the process. But we cannot degrade any human being without degrading ourselves. As Martin Buber said, we cannot thingify any person without thingifying ourselves. The first letter of John says, God is love, and God without love is the constant idolatry of relativizing the absolute and absolutizing the relative. The word love is quite a complex word. Paul Tillich delineates at least 4 forms of love, which includes eros, but is not completed in eros or philia or agape or any other term. Likewise, even agape must be earthed in bodily presence, human vulnerability, and the recognition of value and beauty in the beloved as is. As unselfish and altruistic as agape may be, even the love of God, must recognize some remnant of the image of God in humankind. Agape must see something in us that is worth loving and saving. God has not made us an emptiness to be filled, but a fullness to be shared. We must not pretend. Christopher Stendhal reminds us of this. I meant to read him at the beginning. Christopher Stendhal tells us that to confer all value and recognize no value is to insult the beloved, as if God said, "Look at you wretched creatures. You are nothing, absolutely worthless, but I love you anyway." that is not the spirit or the language of love. Love does not repudiate the creation. If we are indeed made in the image of God and the likeness of God, God sees something in us that is worth loving and saving. Love is a determination to look beyond faults and see worth. It enhances all values and sustains all life. Art without love is confusion. Music without love is noise. Money without noise is slavery. Intelligence without love is arrogance. Competence without love is meanness. Industry without love is pollution. Talent without love is poison. Capitalism without love is greed. Communism without love is regimentation. Conservatism without love is indifference. Liberalism without love is condescension. Worship without love is pretense. Preaching without love is vacuous. Praying without love is selfishness. Work without love is drudgery. Activism without love is frenzy. Faith without love is fanaticism. Retreat without love is cowardice. Reason without love is fear. Power without love is oppression. Truth without love is a lie. Freedom without love is chaos. The Bible without love is incomprehensible. Marriage without love is entrapment. Life without love is death. Death without love is destruction. And God without love is impossible. But here we are, still learning how to love, still learning how to serve, still being liberated and empowered, knowing that through the love of God, we can do all things. So Paul says, I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. The word content stands behind a Greek word that means independent and autonomous. In this kind of love that we have received, we can truly be free because we are truly committed. And we can embrace our opposites and connect our disconnected relations. We can be for personal morality and improve public policy at the same time. We can be for punishing criminals and correcting the pathological causes of crime at the same time. We can be for personal responsibility and support public programs, healthcare and education, welfare and long-term care at the same time. We can do both things. We can do all things through love. It's not either or, it's both and. It's not either wallet or will, it's both will and wallet. Wallet without will is materialism. Will without wallet is fantasy. But both will and wallet will build a new world. It's not prayer or work, both prayer and work. Prayer without work would be evasion, and work without prayer would be self-delusion. But both prayer and work is the power to make a difference in the corner where you stand. It's not volunteers or government, it's both volunteers and government. Volunteers without government are insufficient, and government without volunteers are ineffective. But both government and volunteers can supply human needs. It's not the family or the school that will educate the children. It's both the family and the school. For the family without the school is deprived, and the school without the family is overburdened. But both the family and the school will leave no child behind. It's not God or you that'll make the world better. It's both you and God. God without you would be sealed in God's own self-relatedness, and you without God would be humanly impossible. But you and God working together are an unbeatable combination. It's not romance or finance. It's both. Finance without, pardon me, yes. Finance without romance is boring. And romance without finance is a nuisance. So we have to do both things. And we have to do all things in love. And you can do anything, anything, with the absolute power of God, which is love. If it's your life, you can live it. If it's a job, you can do it. If it's a need, you can match it. If it's a challenge, you can face it. If it's a sickness, you can heal it. If it's a barrier, you can break it. If it's a class, you can teach it. If it's a book, you can write it. If it's a sport, you can play it. If it's a game, you can win it sometimes. If there's a business, you can build it. If there's a gospel, you can preach it. If there's a song, you can sing it. If there's a White House, you can live there. If there's a hell, you can miss it. If there's a heaven, you can reach it. If there's a crown, you can wear it. And since there is a God, we must praise him. For God, she or he or both is love.
Well, thank you, Professor Adams. What a wonderful message from a professor, and what a wonderful message from a pastor. My name is Jethro Joseph. I am the Chief Financial Officer of Harvard Memorial Baptist Church. And I'm humble and appreciative to speak this morning about a man who's been my pastor for over 35 years. He is a pillar in the community, a stone in our church, and has a faith that is solid as a rock. Professor Adams is a gifted professor who teaches biblical tradition related to current conditions. He's a pastor extraordinaire who excites the soul and stirs humanity. He's a prophet of great magnitude who took a flock of members in an urban church and created a dynasty in a church that is grown to the thousands. First of all, I would like to thank the Harvard Divinity School for creating this opportunity to celebrate. The Harvard Memorial Baptist Church has benefited tremendously from this relationship. We have enjoyed the benefit of your students who have interned with us. Just think about the combination. The best institution of higher learning in the country and the best, sharpest mind in the country in terms of biblical manifestation in Pastor Adams. Harvard has benefited in several ways. Week in and week out, we get a rejuvenated message from our pastor who has labored hard in going backwards and forward to Harvard, to Harvard, to Hartford, in providing messages to us that is at the high level that you witnessed today. We're grateful for the role that Harvard played in producing preachers that spread the gospel throughout the world. As we begin our presentation, our church is based on 4 pillars. One is the support of the ministry, the coverage of expenses of the church, the relief of the poor, and the spread of the gospel throughout all nations. Now, when I talked about being a prophet, some years ago, Pastor Adams figured out that in order to survive, we needed more than contribution from what's given on Sunday. We needed to create a diverse giving base, which at that time we created a commercial component of our giving. In the blue, you can see the givings from the church, but at the red, you can see what the support of the church has been from our commercial partners. And it has gone from 7.2 to 7%. And that's a tremendous amount of support for the church in sometimes trying times with the economy. And these are our partnerships. Starting over at the right, Pastor Adams talked about Kmart, which then turned into Home Depot. We are forging a relationship with our senior citizen home, Presbyterian Village, McDonald's, Checkers, KFC, and the like. These are all visionary steps that was instituted by Pastor Adams as he saw a need 20 and 30 years ago to supplement the income from the church. This is the community impact. We have employed almost 500 people as a result of our relationships in the community, as you can see from the different entities. And that had an impact of almost $2.6 million in payroll. If you add the taxes on top of that, and if you also take that back to the last 10 years, you're looking at a tremendous impact in terms of growth in the community, in monies that stay predominantly in that community, where you are employing people of the community. The other significant thing about the church, which has been a result of Pastor Adams' leadership, has been our ability to spend on outreach. We have spent an astounding 37.8% of our budget on outreach. These are things that has to do with senior care, our youth, our music, our world mission, scholarship, our support of conventions. Those are things that are important to our church and will continue to be important to our church. In the 5 years that Pastor Adams has been associated with the relationship with Harvard, our financial picture has been solid and strong. As you can see, and this is a chart we show to the church at our church meetings. On average, we have 21.1 months worth of cash assets to pay our bills. In other words, if we didn't collect a dime for the next 21 months, we could pay our bills. And that's due to the strong, strong leadership of a devoted pastor who has seen fit to put in a visionary policy at our church that works. This is a model, something that we are proud of, and we're going to forge ahead as we continue. These are some future projects that we have in place. We have committed to stay in Detroit. We've looked at other alternatives, but our church is growing. Our church is growing, the need is growing, and we need to enhance our position within the community and within the church. And this is a dynamic growth opportunity for the church. This is a $20 million project that we're pursuing. And we have a significant commitment to pledges. This is a 5-year capital campaign. We've already received commitments that are significant toward this, and we have a real good feeling that we're going to make this commitment. I talked with you earlier about a project that we have with Presbyterian Village, where we're going to erect some senior citizen housing. This is a view of some cottage that we are planning to do. This is a combination of cottage and apartment complex because we looked at the demographics. We have an aging population. The average age in our church every year goes up. And another visionary move, we're looking at the fact that at a point in time, I'm going to need some place to live. And I'm planning for myself. We're planning for ourselves. And this would be a place that I would comfortably live in. So the message is we have a professor. Thank you for your service. We have a pastor. Thank you for your continued patronage of our church. And we have a prophet. Continue to give us guidance that you've given us over the years. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Edith Clifton, proud sister of Professor Adams, and it is my privilege to introduce our next speaker. A recent New York Times article laments the steep decline of conversation. You know, what with emailing, twittering, social media, all those things. We don't have conversation anymore. Yet I was struck in reading Dr. Dillard's book that at the outset she acknowledges the role of conversation when she was growing up. It is the things we overheard as children, and certainly my brother and I remember this too, things we heard around the dinner table that excited our curiosity, that built in us a quest for knowledge, for research, for critical thinking. And this is certainly embodied in our guest speaker today, Dr. Angela Dillard. She is a great scholar. She is a professor. She is a well-read author. She's able to communicate not only at the academic level, but on the lay level, like myself. And she is able to make clear the connections between church and social change. Very important, certainly for the Black church, but perhaps the church universal, that where you see great social change, social transformation, at heart, there is a religious connection. And it excites me when I hear her and read her, because she makes this so plain to us. I'm not going to say anything further. The next voice you will hear is Dr. Angela Dillard.
Good morning, and thank you. Let me take a minute to get the text set up here. Yep. Excellent. And I'm trying to navigate down there at the bottom. Could you? Yep. Thank you. Oh, you want to stretch a minute? You can. Yeah. There we go. Thank you so much. So it's a real honor to celebrate the 5 years that Dr. Charles G. Adams has spent on the faculty here at the Divinity School at Harvard. I have the pleasure of knowing Dr. Adams both as a sort of colleague and fellow academic. I did a letter of recommendation when he was first offered the position here, and I tried to give him advice about being a new faculty member. Not to take on too many service assignments, that it's okay to say no to your chair or your dean, to guard your time jealously, to marshal your resources, to be able to read and write and reflect and to do that kind of work. I'm not sure that he managed to follow any of that advice during his 5 years. At the same time, I'm a congregant. I'm a member of Hartford Memorial Baptist Church in Detroit, which has been my family church since the 1920s. I imagine my mom and dad are sitting at the church in Detroit watching this streaming live. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. It's also the church where my late brother, the Reverend Paul A. Dillard Jr. was first licensed to preach years before coming to Harvard to do his MDiv. So it's, has a special resonance for me to be here this morning. In fact, my brother Paul was one of the first people to really inspire my interest in the Reverend Charles A. Hill, who served as head pastor of Hartford for over 40 years, before the church called Dr. Adams, who has himself now served over 40 years. Hill wedded a relatively conservative theological outlook to an extraordinarily radical vision of political faith. And for me, it's really symbolized by this great photo that's Reverend Hill on the one side with Paul Robeson on the other. Hill's religious and political career helps to ground the first half of my book, Faith in the City, Preaching Radical Social Change in Detroit. And since he was also a mentor to Dr. Adams, I wanted to make sure to invoke his memory today quite prominently. So it's at least a double, maybe even a triple honor to participate in today's forum, designed to think about the connections between Harvard and Detroit, about religion and politics, which is my own area of expertise as a historian of US social movements and political ideologies, and about what it means to preach for social change, which I understand has been one of Professor Adams's popular and well-received courses during his tenure here. Growing up at Hartford and listening to Reverend Adams preach from the pulpit Sunday after Sunday taught me that one does well to begin with a text, a verse or two that serves as a way into the conceptual universe that can define, inspire, breathe life into a sermon, and I hope, an academic music. In that tradition, I want to provide a little text for us to chew on. Then I want to pull way back and expand out to a theoretical framework that I've found useful over the years for understanding the complexity of African American religion. And finally, I want to sketch the contours of a divisive historical moment when men and women of the cloth were forced to actively grapple with the implications of religion, politics, and faith. All right, so text, theory, history, in that order. The text is Isaiah 61:1 by way of a 1944 publication of the Congress of Industrial Organizations entitled Labor and Religion. True religion puts his faith in the people, believing in power with them, not over them. True religion adopts the ethical standard of Christ. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and to set at liberty all who are oppressed. In my contribution to today's proceedings, I want us to think collectively not only about the oddity of a labor union invoking the prophet Isaiah and feeling empowered to discern the difference between true and false religion. And I added the great cartoon by Art Young as another example of this phenomenon. But I also want to think about how complex that differentiation between true and false religion can actually be in practice. That's the text. Now for a little bit of theoretical framework. In their book, The Black Church in the African American Experience, C. Eric Lincoln and Lawrence Mamia posit that the Black church can be defined theologically and sociologically in terms of what they call a Black sacred cosmos that transcends specific denominations, and that can be understood in light of a dialectical model holding a series of polar opposites in tension, constantly moving between these polarities in historical time. Lincoln and Mamia work with 6 binaries in this model: the otherworldly and the thisworldly, the dialectic between the universal and the particular, between the communal and the privatistic, the charismatic and the bureaucratic, and the last 2, which are really relevant, I think, for us today, between the dialectical tension between resistance and accommodation on the one hand, and between the priestly and the prophetic functions of the Black church and its clergy on the other. Priestly churches, they write, are bastions of survival, tending to the spiritual needs of congregants. Prophetic churches are, quote, the networks of liberation, working at the radical edge of God's judgment, often invoking the standard set forth in Isaiah 61. It's a really rich conceptual model to think with and through, but as we all know, real life, lived in historical time, is often a lot messier. Which brings me to my historical example. I am a historian, after all. And it's one that I write about at some length in my book, but don't worry, you'll get the short version today. I won't make you sit through the longer exposition. So it's 1937 in Detroit, Michigan. The Black community is divided on the question of industrial unionism, and the national NAACP has decided to hold its annual convention in the city to hash out the nettlesome issues involved. Everyone knows that the topic of the day is whether the still relatively new UAW, United Auto Workers, which is part of the CIL, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, ought to be supported in its battle against the automotive industry, especially the Ford Motor Company. And at this point, that union is only a couple of years old. Everyone also knows that this was a question that involved many of the city's most prominent and up-and-coming Black ministers lined up on opposing sides. That's what makes this such an interesting historical example to grapple with. On the one side were a host of local Black churches and prominent ministers, such as the Reverend Robert Bradby of Second Baptist Church, the oldest established Black Baptist church in the city, along with Father Everett Daniels of St. Matthew's Episcopal, an equally, if not more prominent congregation, especially in terms of class, and also of great historical significance. Both Bradby and Daniels were staunchly opposed to the new industrial unions and aligned themselves with the power of Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company. And I don't mean to pick on them. These are just two prominent ministers who were aligned with the pro-Ford clergy. And with good reason. From roughly 1918 until the company was finally unionized in 1941, if you were African American and you wanted a job at one of the Ford plants, you had to have a letter from your minister. This letter would certify that you were good, clean, upstanding fellow, you were going to get to work on time, and that you probably weren't interested in any unions. Right? And it was a situation that gave certain members of the clergy an enormous amount of power and prestige. It also gave an enormous amount of power to the company, and that, as other ministers saw it, was precisely the problem. So on the other side of this debate were clergy who were younger, by and large, and heads of less prominent congregations, including the Reverend Charles A. Hill of Hartford Baptist Church then, the Reverend Horace A. White of Plymouth Congregational, and Father Malcolm C. Dade of St. Cyprian's Episcopal. All three stood against the relationship between Black ministers and the Ford Motor Company. All three vigorously endorsed the principles of industrial unionism in general and the UAW in particular. In the late 1930s, as a fledgling UAW-CIL waged this protracted battle to unionize the massive automotive industry, the Reverend White asked rhetorically, who owns the Negro Church? I know that Dr. Adams is quite taken with the Reverend White's article by that name, so let me read you a bit of the key passage from that piece. Writing in the Christian Century magazine in February 1938, White charged that in Detroit, quote, the people interested to see to it that the Negro stays anti-labor start with the preachers. The one organization through which the Negro ought to feel free to express his hopes and work out his economic salvation cannot help him because the Negro does not own it. It belongs to the same people who own the factories. The leadership of the Negro people is still in the hands of the clergymen and will be for years to come, and these clergymen are at the moment leading for the industrialists rather than for the welfare of the Negro people. History, as it turns out, has tended to judge Hill, Dade, and White as correct, and ministers such as Bradby and Father Daniels as wrong, or at least short-sighted. Hindsight is always 20/20, I suppose. But what's important to note is that both the pro-Ford clergy and the pro-union clergy acted in defense of the Black community and in accordance with their understanding of political faith. And it's here, I think, that we can see Lincoln and Mamiya's dialectical model at work as clergy and congregations struggle to find purchase between and among the polar opposites of accommodation and resistance on the one hand, and the priestly and the prophetic on the other. This was an often nasty fight about where the Black church should stand and with whom, and the stakes were high given the expansion of the Black working classes in these years. Tempers flared. In the wake of the 1937 convention, Roy Wilkins, who was then executive director of the NAACP, was still so angry by the time he got back to New York that he pens a scathing editorial denouncing Bradby, Daniels, and the rest of the pro-Ford clergy, averring that their position was, quote, enough to make the Savior weep. But not so fast. One could argue that the pro-Ford clergy was acting out of a deep commitment to the priestly function of the Black church and following a path of true religion. Yes, they threw their considerable weight behind an industrialist and not an industrial labor union, but remember, this is the late 1930s, and nothing in the segregated and racially exclusionary history of American unions, then still dominated by trades and crafts, would lead anyone to believe that any labor union was capable of dealing fairly with African Americans. Moreover, Henry Ford and his motor company was the first and largest employer of Black workers in Detroit, thousands of whom were drawn to the city by Ford's promise of a then unprecedented $5 a day. So in the midst of the three-day fight in 1937 over whether the NAACP should endorse the UAW, Father Daniels spoke for many when he admonished the National Board to mind its own business because, quote, we can't afford to have Ford close down on us. Where would we go? Exactly the point. Where would they have gone? Why not stay with the devil you know rather than risking casting your lot with the unknown? What Ford and the ministers such as Daniels and Bradby had built over the years was an impressive system of patronage that certainly benefited the company, but that also benefited Black churches and their congregants. And again, this is what makes this such a messy, tough thing to think through. Here to just give one example of literally hundreds of letters that Daniels received is one from October 1929 during the early days of the Great Depression. Dear Father Daniels, my husband got reinstated with the Ford Motor Company on Thursday. We called on the phone to let you know, and though did not get you personally, we felt sure the message was delivered. Words fail to express our deep gratitude and appreciation for your kind help in the matter, but we know you will understand our feelings, though we express them poorly. At one point, Father Daniels and St. Matthew's received so many requests for assistance that the church solicited funds for a new employment office with a paid investigator and secretary. Second Baptist had a similar internal office and was a powerhouse in terms of its ability to provide a range of social services, especially to Black Southern migrants and others in profound need. By 1937, this was a solid and largely successful system that was mutually beneficial. The Ford plant got workers, though often in the most dangerous parts of the factory floor, like the foundry. Black workers got wages, which meant that the nascent Black middle class of shop owners and service providers got customers. Churches got tithes. And the churches that were part of the Church Company Alliance got a variety of in-kind gifts of building materials, coal, and so forth. It was accommodationist by design, and it worked within a given system, accommodating to the status quo as opposed to working prophetically against it. But what we really want to say that accommodation is always negative, necessarily a marker of a false faith or a less than true religion. In the early years of the 20th century, Black Detroit, the Reverend Bradby and others like him saw a real and pressing need and moved to find workable solutions, ways of doing God's work, not only in the pews, but in the streets. Dr. Adams has reflected a bit on the complexity of the situation that Reverend Bradby found himself in and the relationship between Bradby and the Reverend Charles A. Hill. And Hill actually got his first job at Second Baptist under Reverend Bradby. They had a close relationship. In a volume of oral histories entitled Detroit Lives, Dr. Adams recalls, quote, Reverend Hill had grown up under Reverend Bradby, even as I grew up under Reverend Hill. Reverend Hill agreed with Bradby that the church should be relevant to the social position and social struggles of the people, but whereas Reverend Bradby wanted to accommodate them to certain strictures upon which they were dependent, such as the Ford Motor Company, Reverend Hill came in on the side of the labor movement. But why Hill, Horace White, and Malcolm Dade sided with the new industrial unions as opposed to this older system of patronage is a really interesting question. I'm not sure that there were any major theological differences at play, though maybe Hill, White, and Dade were a bit closer to social gospel traditions of Rauschenbusch, Fosdick, and others, as Reverend Adams mentioned in getting that library and seeing who Hill had been reading. We could also put on our Marxist thinking caps and consider structural causes. Hill, White, and Dade were much younger than Bradby and Daniels, and perhaps more important, they had less established churches, so less to lose. They also, I think, had a political faith shaped by early years of industrial unionism and radical politics, premised on the ability of blacks and whites to unite and fight, in that famous slogan, and also a willingness to privilege a class politics over a strictly racial one. Unlike Bradby and Daniels, Hill, White, and Dade came of age in an era of mass movements and mass mobilizations, as this dynamic was just beginning to reshape African American political culture. A. Philip Randolph would borrow from labor activism on this large scale in his March on Washington movement in the early 1940s. The NAACP would ultimately vote to side with the UAW and the CIO in their organizing campaigns, including against the Ford Motor Company in 1941. And the effects of this ripple forward for decades, influencing the course of the post-World War II civil rights movement in Detroit and the South and throughout the country. Whenever people ask me about the differences in religion and activism in Detroit today as opposed to the heyday in the 1930s and the 1960s, my response is always tied to the presence and the importance of large-scale social movements, first around labor, later around civil rights. I don't want to take anything away from the courage of men and women such as Reverend Hill or Dr. Adams, who struggled to find a prophetic voice and articulate a prophetic vision, channeling the dictates of Isaiah and Amos into contemporary social, political, and economic challenges. But when one is charged with the dictates of preaching deliverance and fighting oppression, it helps to have a mass movement at your back. Yet, under any circumstances, I think it's fair to say that the prophetic vision has always had to struggle to be heard within the history of the Black church in America. Barbara Savage did good service to us all by reminding us that the prophetic tradition has never been the dominant strain in African American religious history. In her most recent book, Your Spirit Walks Beside Us, The Politics of Black Religion, she writes, quote, although the churches were continually called upon to be savior institutions, historically, they were most often criticized for failing in that mission. In the first half of the 20th century, the dominant political narratives treated African American religion with despair and disdain. The emergence in the late 1950s of a Southern civil rights movement with churches, church people, and church culture at its center was a powerful and startling departure from that story rather than a natural progression. Thus, while it has never been easy to preach or practice or even define true and prophetic religion, I also think we tend to rush to judgment about what might constitute bad faith, bad religion in action, and that we set the bar too low. The religious debate over unionization in Depression-era Detroit was not about good versus bad religion as much as it involved really central questions of faith, political theology, economics, and social life. We fail to think clearly on this issue at our own collective peril. And it's here that we've been blessed with some real insights from Dr. Professor Pastor Adams. In the foreword to my book, he writes of Hill, I'll give you one last nice picture of him, that, quote, Hill showed to the whole world the power of the love of God to change the world. There's an old Black spiritual, he continues a few lines down, that asks the question, is you got good religion? Not just is you got religion, but is it good religion? And then there's a whole lot of, this is still the quote, there's a whole lot of dangerous, bad, sick religion in the world. Bad religion can make you hard, cold, mean, and insensitive. Bad religion is worse than no religion. He goes on to link bad religion to everything from the medieval military crusades to the Inquisition and the enforcement of religious conformity, to apartheid in South Africa, slavery and segregation in America, September 11th, the crucifixion of Jesus, and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Quote, "That's why Grandma wanted to know," he writes, returning to this refrain in good preacherly mode, "is you got good religion." And I love this riff at the end, because I think for me it really captures not only Dr. Adams's style as a preacher, but his style as a thinker. And it seems more appropriate to end on his words than my own. Bad religion takes life, good religion gives life. Bad religion castigates fold, good religion liberates folk. Bad religion talks about national defense, good religion talks about national purpose. Bad religion divides folks, good religion unites folks. Bad religion makes you hate folks, good religion makes you love everybody. Bad religion segregates, good religion integrates. Bad religion stays in the church, good religion breaks loose in the world. Bad religion hangs around the altar, good religion walks down the Jericho road with healing in its hands. Bad religion is shaped like a spurious pole, trying to reach up to God without reaching out to anybody. Good religion is shaped like a cross, the vertical beam reaching up to God for power, and a horizontal beam reaching out to people and sharing love, power, peace, joy, hope, life, freedom, jobs, education, and opportunity all around. Is you got good religion. When we get good religion, true religion, strong religion, inclusive religion, we will not be discouraged by anyone, defeated by anything, destroyed by any evil. Thank you.